So, hello and welcome everyone to another D6 Learning event. It's the first of this brand new academic year. With us, we have Stefano Gualeni, who is he's an author, he's a philosopher. He talks about games, he makes games occasionally. He teaches at the University of Malta in the Institute of Digital Game, but also occasionally at a place called LCAD in California. It's all about games. I'll be sharing his site later on in the chat. But also, he is the author of several books which I have loved, and we at D6 Learning have also loved. So we will be mainly talking about what we owe the dead today, but also about fictional games, so games that don't quite exist yet. Also, if anyone is wondering why D6 Learning is actually talking about books and philosophy and the study of games, well, as you know, we are a school.
Comic strips, TV shows, animation, video games, and so on and so forth. It is by definition that these games cannot directly be accessed or played by the audience, in the sense that those are normally games that are presented to us as imaginary constructions that are games for the characters and the protagonists of fictions, meaning that we understand them as games in a indirect, oblique fashion. They are not games for the reader, the moviegoer, the theater goer, and so on, but they are games for the characters within those fictional worlds. Maybe you're a bit confused and wondering, what are you talking about specifically? Well, these two examples might clarify what I mean. In case you've seen the original trilogy of Star Wars, but this is also something that repeats in more modern iterations of that same franchise, you might have seen a game called Holochess or Dejarik in the original series, which looks like this kind of high-tech, holographic kind of chessboard in which things happen and creatures fight and so on and so forth. Obviously, this is a fictional game in the sense that we don't know how it plays out. We only see it as part of Star Wars, and we, in a way, as audience, witness the game being played in a context that is unserious and playful and friendly, but we see that it's turn-based and it responds to rules, so it has many of the ingredients of those things that we call games as social phenomena in our world. Another famous example is Quidditch, for example, the fictional sport that is part of the Harry Potter franchise and is played with 3 balls and a snitch, and it's played by wizards that fly on brooms, and a bunch of different things, including a certain incompleteness in its description, make it impossible for us to play as players. We cannot possibly play Quidditch because we don't fly on brooms, and a snitch does not, this kind of magical creature made of gold who flies around the field, does not exist in the world that we share as biological creatures. So these games are incomplete in their representation, like all fictional phenomena. And, well, they're only meant to trigger the imagination of the appreciator of fiction and not to be played, or at least they were not meant to be originally something playable, which is something that my students sometimes, when I talk about fictional games in that sense, comment about. They raise their hand and say, well, the 2 examples that you've just raised exist as playable games, right? This is a board game version of Dejarik, which also has a checkers board on the back. You can buy it, this kind of game at Disney kind of amusement parks, right? Similarly, Quidditch exists in a variant called Muggle Quidditch, so Quidditch for people who are not magic users, which is a sport by which, again, you use 4 different balls or 3 different balls, and you ride sort of broomsticks and so on and so forth. Obviously, I can claim and I can say that, well, those are not fictional games anymore. Those are derivative other things, right? They are creations that were, in a way, fixed, completed, amended, arranged so that human beings with limited amount of resources and technologies can play also without the use of advanced technology or magic, right? So my point here being, those are not fictional games. Those are other things that are inspired by fictional games and then completed and fixed, arranged so that we could access them as players. Another interesting example is that of Gwent, right? This should be an example that is familiar with many of you. Gwent is a card game that is part of the fictional world of the fantasy franchise The Witcher. It is part both of the various novels that compose this universe and of the first The Witcher game by CD Projekt Red, which is a 2007 action fantasy role-playing game. Within The Witcher, the original game, and the books of The Witcher, Gwent is a fictional game. So it is described in its functioning as a fictional prop, something for us to imagine being played. The game contains many cards, for example, and some rules, and the cards in a way are connected with the fiction of that world, and it's all very interesting with knights and peasants and trebuchet and ambushes and so on. All good and proper. The game is part of the world building of The Witcher. Something different happens in The Witcher 3 when the game of Gwent, which is, I repeat, mostly a card game, is not only accessed or enjoyed as a background enriching tool for world building, but it actually becomes something that is playable. In this case, in technical terms, in game studies terms, The Witcher 3 is a nested game, or in more informal terms, a mini game. What that means is that it's a game that the players of a larger game can decide to play within the larger game, right? So in The Witcher 3, I can stop my quests and my gallivanting the world of The Witcher to stop by an inn or buy some NPCs and play a hand or two of Gwent as a game in its own sake. Later on, again in 2018, Gwent became a standalone competitive video game, which again is no longer a fictional game. It is something that developed and was completed, arranged, adapted for human play, like for human consumption. There are many fictional games, and they come in a variety of forms. They can be part of cartoons, like anime, for example. Cartoons, in the case of animated series, is like The Simpsons. I don't know if you remember Bone Storm 2 or Bone Storm 3. They're like riffs on Mortal Kombat and on stupid, violent fighting games in the 90s. If you like Parks and Recreation, there's an entire episode that is based on a fictional game, which is a game that the characters play within the series called The Cones of Dunshire. In both cases, both in The Simpsons and in Parks and Recreation, the fictional game in question is used as a way to convey a comedic message. There are more serious fictional games like Kepesh Yakshi, which you see here represented in this screenshot from BioWare's Mass Effect 3, which serves not only to convey like enriching the idea that the world of Mass Effect 3 is rich with detail and interconnected, but it also carries a number of other information about the context in which people play. In Mass Effect 3, for example, you can tell that, similar to our world, people spend time in separate locations to play games. Like this game here, Kepesh Yakshi, is played in a sort of an intergalactic arcade of sorts. And what kind of games do people play in this arcade? Well, you can see a fighting game in the background and a sort of like chess-like board in the foreground, which is the game I'm going to talk about right now. And you could perhaps infer that also in their civilization, also in Mass Effect 3, gaming is a sort of competitive practice in which people, players, are supposed to optimize their performance seeking a certain quantifiable result, right? You can see that there's energy bars and there's different units on the board which suggest On the background, a similarity with the fighting games that we know, and on the foreground, a similarity to strategy games such as chess, for example, or real-time strategy games. Kepesh Yakshi is a turn-based game that the players of Mass Effect do not get to play. In fact, it's the characters who play and play according to the rules of the game, but we, as audience, as observers from the outside, get to understand a few things that maybe characterize their cultures. This is a game, Kepesh Yakshi, that is about territorial domination, about the extraction of resources, about trying to achieve the maximum performance with the pieces that we have. And it looks like the pieces that we play on this board are not all of the same kind. There's some hierarchy among them, similar with chess, right? In which like the king and queen are very important and precious tools, whereas a pawn could be, for example, sacrificed for a higher cause. What that tells us is that probably the culture in which they're in is not only technologically advanced, but it's also presumably based on values that are those of, let's say, territorial control, competition, warfare, and the instrumental use of rationality for strategy, for example. So we're already getting about the world of Mass Effect 3 a lot of interesting and layered information about that culture and the context in which the game takes place just by looking at the kind of games they play. There's also an added bonus in this. By seeing games being played, we also witness something that in literature is called indirect characterization. What that means is that through activities that happen during a book, a movie, or a show, in this case, through their playing a video game or a board game in this case, we get to know the characters better. We get to know aspects of the characters that we might not see in other circumstances. For example, are they prone to cheating? Are they sore losers? Are they skilled and intelligent? Are they flexible with their mind? Are they playful? Are they bantering? And so on and so forth. So through seeing characters playing games, we add depth and characterization to those characters. A similar example you would see, for example, in a fictional game called Wicked Grace. In this case, it's Dragon Age by the same developers as Mass Effect, called BioWare. I presume you are to a degree familiar with the games that I'm mentioning. All the fictional games that I talked about up until this point have a background function. I already described several of these functions, including that of world building or the indirect characterization of fictional characters. So when these fictional games serve this kind of background, enriching, contextualizing function, we normally call them background fictional games. So they operate in a way under the hood of the fiction that we are enjoying. There are, however, games that are more focal to the plot and the story or the narrative that we are enjoying. I can make a few examples. Take, for example, the gladiatorial arena of the Running Man in 1983 movie, right? The entirety of the game, I was saying, but the movie takes place almost entirely within a televised game show, right? So it's obvious that the qualities of the game are central to the plot and give context to the entirety of the plot. Maybe some of you were not even born in 1983, so I prepared some other examples that are more today, right? So, for example, if you've seen The Hunger Games, either read the books or watched the movies or played video games related to it, you might be familiar also with its arena, which is a game. You can talk about Squid Game, for example, the Korean TV show that was an international sensation a few years back, or books like Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. You might notice that when a fictional game has a central role within a work of fiction, the idea of game right, tends to appear in the title. So you know it's going to be a very sort of game-like or game-based or game contextualized piece of fiction. So this was a bit of a distinction between background functions in fictional games and in a way like fictional games being at the forefront of a certain fiction. We're almost at the end of my small introduction. And I want to make the same move that I made at the beginning. So I'm telling you, I'm a philosopher who studies games, but I'm also somebody who doesn't only talk the talk, but also walks the walk, in a sense that to propose and to show how video games can be philosophical tools, I made some, right? I try to show and think about and talk about how that can happen. So also in this case here, I wrote a book about fictional games, so games that only exclusively exist as part of fictional worlds. And the next logical step was that of walking the walk, that is, creating some fictional games as part of my work. It is in this sense that I wrote two novels in the past 3 years. One is titled The Clouds, and it was published by Routledge, which is a larger producer, is a bit more expensive. The newest one that was published this year is called What We Owe the Dead, and as I mentioned, is published by Set Margins, who is based rather in the Netherlands. Both of these works of fiction contain fictional games that do a bunch of different works, in a sense that they have multiple roles within these particular texts. And I like to go around and talk about the books and talk about the role games have in his books. And so that's basically the reason why I'm here and why I need to thank Konstantinos for giving me like a small platform about it, to talk to you about it rather. Now, I would like to introduce to you this second book in particular, which is called What We Owe the Dead, which is kind of funky and weird because it is sort of a detective novel in a futuristic world. And I'm saying it's kind of funky because it's not really a detective novel that studies or examines or talks about a criminal case of sorts, but rather it is a detective novel that investigates an investigation on a case. So it's something quite bizarre. Now, I don't want to talk about the book myself because that would be a bit sort of self-referential and also maybe annoying for you that had me talk about games and fictional games for now about 15, 20 minutes. So I would like to give the word rather to Konstantinos. So he, having read the book, can perhaps introduce it and talk about world building and the role of games within this particular work.
So thank you, Stefano, and thank you for walking us through the world of fictional games for those who hadn't had the chance to actually think about those. Now, when it comes to What We Owe the Dead, first of all, I would like to make a small parenthesis and mention the fact that this is a book that is not just beautiful, it's also beautifully illustrated. So it does feature the work of common friend Daniele Certini, who has created those little black and white vignettes that very interestingly are also part of the world building itself. And this also leads me to mention the fact that even though not traditional as a detective novel, What We Owe the Dead is an investigation and it is built a bit like a puzzle box. And this also applies to its world building. And this is something that, as I've already told Stefano on a different occasion, is something that I really enjoyed. The fact that you're not just presented with this incredibly detailed world, but you have a world that is being hinted at. You have a world within which those investigation documents you're going through have actually been written, and you are exposed gradually to this world. And I don't want to spoil it, but I want to mention that this is a place that's taking place in a dystopic version where of humanity, where a huge natural catastrophe has occurred, and people are forced to live in those megastructures in Antarctica and places where the heat hasn't scorched everything completely. It's interesting. It's unique, and what I absolutely adored was the use of gaming within it, and b myth. Now, before I go on and ask Stefano to give us an example of how myth could actually be used within a fictional setting to give us a good idea of how people feel, I have to mention that there is this fascinating game within it. When it actually gets revealed to you as something beyond a mere reference, you will feel very, very strongly about, you know, the importance of games, and you will get to think about, you know, what society means and for a game, and what cultural references can do to a game, and perhaps you'll even feel a bit like an archaeologist. I don't want to say too much. I really would like to urge people to read it. I have to mention that if you're based in Greece, which is quite a possibility, if you're watching this, the book is also available from Hyper Hippo, I think it's called, right, which is a bookstore in Monastiraki. So you can actually go and grab it there. And having said those two things, again, it's back to you, Stefano, to know show
Sure.
us a glimpse of mythical stuff.
Yes, I also would like to insist on the representation of games, but maybe that is a topic that we're gonna maybe discuss a bit later when we get into maybe a question and answer format and so on. For now, I want to follow up on what you said, Konstantinos, which is this is a work of fiction and is presented as an investigation. Also, it is presented as a draft of a police report, right? It's very specific. If I wanted to be particularly constrained in the particular way of looking and feeling like a police report of sorts in the process of being written, I could not do what most other writers do or have the freedom to do, that is, dump long and detailed explanation on the readers, right? So the book, as Costadino mentions, only hints at the world around the investigation without necessarily giving all the explanation needed to figure out what the world behaves and feels like, but rather it's so accidental and oblique and overheard, right? So that was an interesting kind of way to do world building. Now, in complete contradiction to what I said, I'm going to read a passage of the book to give you an idea of how it works or how it feels, maybe. And it is the only part of the book, maybe, when a little bit of an explanation actually takes place. Okay? I'm going to go through a piece that relates to myth and the construction of one of these towers that you see now on screen. This is one of the pictures made for the book. It's about 22 pictures in the book by Daniele Giardini, a Roman comic artist. And it shows one of the mega towers in which the investigation and the novel takes place. Now, at a point in the novel, the protagonist, so the person writing this police report that constitutes the novel, talks with a local police captain. And the police captain explains a few things about the history of the tower that this captain writing the report didn't know much about. So I'm going to read an extract that is in front of me. I think it's from chapter 3. And bear with me, it's a bit of an explanation, but it's the only part in the entirety of the 200 pages of the book that resembles an explanation, right? So the old captain says to the new captain, well, if you want to know more about this part of the tower, you want to look up the bird people, right? The bird people. If you saw this picture here in the presentation, you already have an indication. Maybe this is a reference to the myth of Icarus, so maybe it's referencing the bird people, who knows? Anyway, let me get started with the quote. All right. That same night, After having had dinner in my hotel room, I fulfilled my promise to Captain Kutta. That is, I quick searched for information concerning the bird people. This is what I found. In the early phases of the construction of the first mega tower, Android technology was still prohibitively expensive. At the time, the automata's ability were better suited for repetitive and heavy labor rather than tasks that required finesse. This limited their initial use to the digging of the foundation of the megatower and jobs such as the transportation and laying of pipes or the housing of the ammonia tanks at the basis of the thermosiphon. But in the early stages of development of Hosming 1, most construction jobs were typically performed by people hanging several kilometers above the Antarctic soil, and this labor was the exclusive domain of human workers. Climate migrants from Southeastern Asia, desperate to survive and secure a future for their children, accepted employment building the megatowers in conditions that it would no longer morally or legally accepted for humans to perform, or even T3 artificial intelligences. The life expectancy of those workers was, of course, shockingly low, and work-related deaths were in the thousands before the droids took over. Now, there are a few folk tales, mostly shared among people of Pakistani and Indian heritage, recounting the story of the humans who constructed the towers in these early stages. According to these stories, after years of working on miles-high scaffolding and hanging from harnesses, some of the workers managed to do the impossible. They learn to breathe the thin air of the stratosphere and tame the turbulent winds that howl outside Hosming 1. Spending the best part of the days among the swallows, these workers eventually learned how to glide and eventually to fly. Free like the birds, the dark-skinned men and women soared away and never returned to the tower. There is another and almost opposite myth that accounts for construction workers who did not return home after a day of work. This parallel legend talks about men who, instead of growing wings, turned completely into swallows. Unlike the first kind of birdmen, the ones who transformed into swallows did not leave Hosming 1 for good, but rather come back every year, continuing to visit their friends and relatives autumn after autumn. That is the conclusion of this little section. I hope that was kind of a bit evocative of what the novel might sound like. And again, sorry for the long explanation, but this is the only part that I could use without spoiling or without hinting. So this was kind of a way to get you a bit into the atmosphere of this strange book about tall towers, incredible games, and a mystery. Before I give the work to Konstantinos, I want you to think about the fact that these towers that I'm talking about, these siphon mega towers, are to a degree the product of my own fantasy, but at the same time, those like multi-kilometers, the ones in the book are about 13 kilometers high, are actual solutions devised against climate change. So these kind of mega siphon towers are things that might eventually exist if we get to such a bad situation in our relationship with the environment that we might need to cool down the atmosphere. How does it work? Very simply, those kind of big structures poke their heads out into the stratosphere. And they have like huge pumps at the bottom that pump a refrigerating fluid, normally like it's ammonia based, up to the top part of the tower when they get cooled down because it's about minus 80 in that part of the atmosphere. And then push the refrigerated liquid back to the bottom of the surface of the planet. What that means is that eventually we take coolness, or we from the opposite point of view, we shed heat over the stratosphere where the carbon dioxide doesn't impede the irradiation, and bring down cool ammonia to make the air closer to the surface fresher. if you imagine this being done in a scale of 1,000 towers, this could have a palpable effect in years. So we could try to cool down the surface of the world with this sort of like air conditioning unit for the planet, right? And in the novel, the idea was to, well, the situation deteriorated so fast that in order to survive, we needed to live temporarily within those air conditioned tubes for a few generations, right? And the crime which the novel talks about happens in one of those leap generations that try to recover the planet from almost a sure catastrophe. I hope this is sort of interesting for you at this point. And in case you have questions about the book or the games in the book or the novel, how to get a novel off your feet, because I presume that many people in the audience might be people who want to maybe write or share the stories with a larger audience. All of these questions are valid and interesting, and I'm here with you for a little more time. So I suggest that you take that initiative and that opportunity in case you're interested in those kind of things.
So thanks again, Stefano. And as you just read this Birdman passage from the book, I have to admit that besides being very novel in that it actually tries to give you concrete stuff about the world building. Obviously, it does not. What I really enjoyed in this passage is the fact that it starts off with this very far off, quite mythological, quite unexpected explanation of what those birdmen are. And as soon as it tells you that you're about to get your second explanation, you are sort of mentally prepared and you're imagining that, okay, this is the fluffy one, this is the mythical one. Now I'm about to get the actual explanation of what's going on. And you get an even more mythical one, an even weirder one. And this was quite unexpected. And I have to say that most of the things, both in the plot and in the world building, which besides the actual science which I never imagined existed, is very cyberpunk in its essence. I mean, there are some philosophical questions which I don't know if we would consider it to be spoilery or not to reference them. But I think there is this question of what makes you a human, a person, what is it? And in a context that is becoming increasingly relevant, or at least discussed, I think that this element of the little surprise is something that constantly keeps creeping up in the books. I mean, you, even at the beginning, you start from a very familiar office space, and suddenly you open up to this mega structure that you referenced. Obviously, this is not a question. This is just this is just pointing out things. But I do have a question, and my first question, while perhaps people are thinking about what to ask for or not, because I do have several questions for you.
They can decide to do what they like
Yes,
if they don't have anything to ask.
absolutely. So my first question is, why did you choose to follow the form and some of the logic of the detective genre?
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. Also, like an easy one for me in the sense that that is already mentioned in the afterword to the novel. And so I thank you for giving me the opportunity to sort of brief on something that I know rather than something that I need to try to reconstruct in my mind. There's a brief explanation as to how this text came to be. And the reason why I decided to go for a detective novel, being a game designer and being somebody interested in games and being somebody who writes about games even in their novels, is that you might argue that it's the most playful, at least according to some theorists, of the literary genres. I'm referring, for example, to work by S.S. Van Dyne or even the quite famous game philosopher Bernard Suits writes about the detective novel as a game-like form of literature. The reason for that, you can imagine, I presume all of our audience can imagine quite directly, in the sense that, in a way, it is structured as a challenge for the reader to join the dots and potentially arrive at the end of, or the solution to this puzzle before the fictional detective does, right? It's a sort of like a challenge against the author, I'm smarter than you and I can use your tools against yourself to get there and feel smug about my own intellectual skills. At the same time, if we see it instead from the point of view of the of the author, instead we have almost the obligation or the expectation to obfuscate, give some red herring, some false steps, some dead ends to the narrative, which adds to the idea that this is a book, this What We Owe the Dead, a book that you explore more like a puzzle or a maze rather than something that you get to know linearly, right? So both as a player, as a reader, and as an author or a game writer, this kind of literary genre facilitates talking about game because it's a large game in itself, and also helps the reflection on what games are, what makes a game, and the cultural / social relevance of games. To conclude this little tangent, I wanted to add to what you said, that indeed it has philosophical themes, and I can list three. So maybe whoever is listening might be more or less interested based on what I just say. One, there's this idea of personhood. What makes a person, and how much can you take away from a person and still call that a person? This includes privacy, parts of their body, parts of their memory, and so on and so forth. Number two, there's this idea of the foundational role of games and playing in a society, right? This comes back especially at the end of the book. And number three, it's the titular question of what are our obligations towards the ones who came before us, right? Do we need to respect what they wanted? Are we, in a way, following up on their project? Is there something that we cannot do with the dead people once they're dead? So I would say those are the three key points, that the various elements of the plot, including the myths that you're exposed to or the games that you get to see as or read about as part of the plot, contribute to those three mega themes, I would say. I hope you picked up on some of them by reading, but the thing is that, like, even if you didn't pick them up at all, it holds water as a story in its own sake, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't need to be literate in games or philosophy to enjoy it. That's another thing that I believe is true. I don't know how you feel about it, Konstantinos.
Yes, I do agree. I think it's a very enjoyable, actually engrossing book. But I also think it's impossible to ignore its philosophical undertones. And by that, what I mean is that any any and all philosophical books, even though they tend to be portrayed as dull and long and boring and tiresome in popular culture, in reality, what they mainly do is that they, I mean, besides suggesting systems and ideas and stuff, they actually do make you think. And by reading What We Owe the Dead, and by encountering those versions of humanity that are again, in fear of spoiling anything, closer to AI and cyborgs and this sort of thing, you are sort of forced to sit down and think. Or the way that games are mentioned, even if you don't care about such questions, this is something that you will have to pause your reading and actually start contemplating. It's like, how would an ancient Egyptian game, for example, actually be played? How can we interpret how Senate is being played nowadays? And those are things that are enjoyable, even if it's the first time that you are actually engaging with them. So I think that this works. But I do have a question here. It's like, it is an open philosophical work of fiction, right? And this is quite a rarity those days. And even though the obvious answer as to why is that, okay, I'm also a philosopher, the question is like, really, why? Why choose to do that?
Konstantinos, that is such a good question that I can only spoil it with a bad answer. And the bad answer is that, sadly, this is what I wanted to do. This is nobody forced me to do it. I don't need it for my career. It's just a product of love and interest. You were talking about the fact that even if you're not interested in games or imagining speculatively the future of society, or about philosophical ideas, you could get something out of it.
Mm.
Part of the reason is that I believe you are a person who's socially aware, interested in games, very invested in a number of ways in the social value of games. So, yeah, another ambulance is passing.
Things are
Okay.
getting wild in
And so
Malta.
I was just mentioning the idea that similar to you, I come with that some kind of frame of mind in which
Mm.
games can be useful. Culture is foundational. Becoming a humanist is also becoming a better citizen. And so I wrote a book that I would have liked to read. There's no bigger magic or bigger reasons other than this is the kind of book that I think it was important to write and maybe pleasurable to read. So why? And then you go like, you know that it's harder and harder to publish, especially fiction. And in this day and age, it's even harder to publish stuff that is of that kind, that in a way culturally engaged, is not just for mere entertainment. You know that it's pretty obvious by looking at what's happening in the United States that there's a strong anti-intellectualistic sentiment
Mm.
by which, I don't know, probably politics and heavy thinking and thinking about each other and our future society should perhaps not be part of our entertainment. And I think that is a bit, like similar to the discussion, leave politics out of my game. Novels, culture is already political because we are the polis, the many. We are living in a society, and there's no way that something that you do or say in a social context doesn't have a political social connotation. So even if I didn't want to, any books are political, any books contain philosophical dimensions, and I just gave it my own little flavor, that is existentialism, game theory, and so on and so forth. One could even say it's
I have to
previous.
ask you,
Please go.
because this is something that I have been discussing with a variety of people, and there are people who have very strong feelings about that, and people who have very strong hopes about that. But the question is, if we make and I do mean like a vastly popular um, book or movie or game or any sort of cultural artifact that we hope can influence people, and this takes a strong political stance, do you feel that this can actually change anything, or is it more something that almost by definition preaches to the converted, makes us feel good, and perhaps inspires one or two people out of the millions that are going to watch it or read it or play it?
Now I'm gonna just ruin everything because, I mean, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, before the war in Ukraine, I would have said, well, it's our task. And at least as far as Western culture is involved, this is what we've been talking about and discussing for thousands of years, starting from, again, the Greeks and the idea of the Republic, the rights of animals, the equality for men, women, and all kinds of people and provenances and skin tones and so on and so forth. Then you see something like the war in Ukraine first and the genocide in Gaza, because I don't see there's any point in calling it
No,
anything,
nothing else can be.
taking place, and Western cultures, Western nation reacting as if nothing was the matter. As long as it's my friend and there's economical interest, that is okay and perhaps something not condemning or worth intervening in. I don't have a solution for this idea, but certainly reflecting on me or you or ourselves as an intellectual community, we can say that we spent 3,000 years thinking about problems like living together and ethics and what is a good life and thoughts of that kind, to be in 2025 still in a tribalistic, oppressive, with a level of stupidity and indignity that is impossible to almost withstand. It almost seems ridiculous to me to talk about my book with games and future speculation when this is happening. So, to your question, is anybody listening, and does it make a difference? At this point, my answer would be probably not. It's almost like that play by Sartre in which you're in hell, and all you can do is talk to each other and start thinking in a small room. And one of the final lines of this famous play by Sartre go like, well, is there escape? Is there hope? And the characters say, no, there's no hope, but there's nothing else to do. So we might as well go on and continue to hope, right? So the idea here is evidence from media and contemporary politics throughout Europe and the West is screaming to my face that culture has been failure and rather useless for the past 3,000 years. Does that? You can tell me that we're wrong, but I mean, if you see how deportations, bombing of children, mass starvation, invasion, the US supporting their friends just because they have political and economical ties, denouncing and in a way like going against even the constitutional principles that they should be based on, then what is there? If the Constitution means nothing, is alliance and dignity and ethics mean nothing, what do we have to rely on apart from money and strength?
I imagine that we are in a phase, in a Gramscianly seen as a monstrous, barbaric phase of things, which can only be temporary. But yeah, this would be too much, too heavy, too political a
It's
conversation.
been temporary for 3,000 years that we've been stomping on each other's head.
Yeah, we're still in our prehistory, I would argue. Hopefully, we'll get out of there soon, or at least like sooner than later. So, another question: would you say that, as you've actually tried to do that, and it would be interesting to see. I mean, do you think that video games and this ludic expression can be a conduit for philosophical ideas? Again, not as propaganda or spreading ideas, but as I am interested in discovering specific ideas. I'm interested in experimenting with specific notions, with versions of philosophy and takes of philosophy. Can games actually be helpful? Can they be a conduit for that?
And this is another great question because you know that this is most of my life's work is on in that field. So the answer is complicated as everything that you study for a long time. There's never like a absolute answer to yes or no. My answer would be yes, but in a sense that it was proven that games can be rhetorical and communicative artifacts, all good and proper. And can we do philosophy of games? There's many examples in which they can educate, raise questions, accompany somebody's thinking. So I have no doubt that it is good and possible to use this new media form to vehicle important ideas. At the same time, I realized that certain ideas work better in, if not, let's not call them games, let's say virtual environmental simulations and so on and so forth. The fact that they are playful is an extra feature rather than a fundamental feature, as I see it. For example, games are particularly good at proposing the idea of taking responsibility for one's action, evaluating alternative paths, dealing with complex situation in a number of different angles. They're particularly good at stimulating a active and personal involvement in issues, for example, ethical issues, or that of governance, like how to build a proper city, how should we regulate international, let's say, trade, and so on. There are other things about philosophy that video games are not particularly good at dealing with, because philosophy, of course, is a very broad sense, sort of almost encompassing discipline. So text is a fantastic tool. Pictures are fantastic tools. Movies and videos and scheme are fantastic tools. Video games, or let's say virtual worlds, are a subset of a vast array of media that we can use. They have their upsides. They're very good at communicating and providing the knowledge of a certain set of ideas, mostly to do with space, action, ethics, responsibility, speculation towards the future. And they're very bad with others that are very awkward to be modeled in digital environments or as algorithms and procedures. One example would be, for example, let me think about something that philosophy would not. I was trying to say philosophy of language, right? It's kind of okay to try to do that with games, and I tried myself, but maybe it is better left to language, right? To do philosophy of language. To a degree, saying like game philosophy is perhaps better done with games because, for example, the cases and the situation and the experiential dimension of what you're supposed to be reflected on could be given to you in the very form in which you need to of what you need to reflect upon. So there are certain things that, in my opinion, work particularly well. Like take, for example, another stupid idea, um, a book or a long paper. They have a lot of arguments and a lot of nuance, and we can pass from one topic to the other. The connection between topics and the proof of what I'm saying might be very abstract, or like we're using a variety of registers and talking about a variety of topics at different level of abstraction, and text allows to move between those layers and to join those dots very well, seamlessly. We do it every day when we talk to one another.
Hmm.
In games, imagine to produce a game that does the work of a theoretical book. You would need an incredibly large game that is going to be prone to exploits, misunderstanding, failures, glitches. Perhaps certain things are very awkward to, as in logics and language, are not particularly awkward, or statements or syllogisms. Yeah, they can be done with games, but maybe it's not their native soil. Do you know what I'm saying?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
to me, there's hope. I've written extensively about it, but it will be a far cry from for me to say that video games are an optimal philosophical tool or the sole philosophical tool that we're going to use in the future to instruct and think with.
Right, but it is one of the mediums that we have at our disposal for art, for philosophy, for expression of any kind.
How do you feel about this? Do you have a position, or does the
I
audience have a position?
think I think that some certain elements can be made clearer through video games. For example, I had a philosophy professor, philosophy of science. We had him the first year in the Polytechnic, and he had this excellent argument when discussing infinity and the end of space and those things, which he like fanatically opposed the end of space as an idea. And his argument was try to imagine it. Like imagine no space. And you will obviously be unable to imagine such a thing. And he argued that if something is so preposterous and so weird that you cannot even imagine it, then it probably could never exist. Which is an interesting point. I don't say I really agree with that. But the thing with video games is that they can help you imagine things that are imaginable, and they can immerse you in those previously unimaginable places and worlds and situations and everything. So perhaps in that aspect, they could do something very unique because you're not just looking at something, you are within it and you have, okay, an amount of agency, which is very interesting. Again, not that we've really explored it yet, but it is something that sort of formulates an idea that could be applied. We could show different societies, we could show different modes of living and production and whatever within games. So that would be interesting. Again, I don't feel that anything can surpass books when it comes to science and philosophy and things that need people to actually spend concrete time. But as an introduction, I would say they could also work wonderfully. So yeah, this is something resembling a position. Now, I have one last question for you, and this has to do back. We have to go back to the book, and we've already mentioned that this is effectively an investigation of an investigation, which is already a few layers removed from the actual event, which is very interesting. And you also have this um, novel or even experimental way of presenting the text. I mean, there are some parts that have been striked out. There are some comments. There's a lot of play with typography and how things are arranged and everything. And I do feel that those things contribute to 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 the world building again and to how we perceive what it is we're reading. And my question is like, would you say that this is close to an epistolary? Is this close like to the logic of, I don't know, Frankenstein or Lovecraftian stuff. It's like it, this very diegetic and very immersive way of presenting information. I mean,
Uh,
at least people within the world could know.
it's interesting because, I mean, you mentioned one of the diegetic modes of presenting, which is the epistolary text or the epistolary novel. But there's also other novels that take the form of a police report. So it's not the first of its kind.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I know it in Italian, the title, sorry, it's, if in case you're interested, by Trabucchi is called Sostiene Pereira, like Pereira so maintains that. That's the kind of the title of the book. And so you say, like, is it similar to the epistolary novel? Well, it has some differences, obviously, because in this case here, the objective is not that to be very directly talking to somebody and therefore like shaping the conversation and giving a hint of the relationship between two or more characters. In this case, there's a pretense of objectivity in which the writer of this report tries to explain things as they understand actually happened. So the fact that there are, as you mentioned, this is not really a detective report. It's a draft of a detective report in which the author is constantly redacting, adding personal notes, and so on and so forth. This works in two different ways. In one way, it gives you an idea of where the story is going and whether the narrator is reliable in how they convey information. And in the second one, in the epistolary novel, you have characters talking to each other about their emotions and the life world, which is not something that you would see in an official report, right? An official report, by definition, tries to be detached and objective and remove that aspects of life. So by leaving in deleted parts and personal notes, I try to recuperate a bit of the epistolary dimension, right? So that I can have both the objective report, in a sense, and a bit of a sense of who the person writing is. It's a bit of a trick to have my cake and eat it too, right? So I tried with this kind of hybrid trick by which I could do something that looks official, but at the same time, it still contains personal dimensions, mistakes, decisions. The being deleted of some of the report also has a plot relevance towards the end, but this is a puzzle that we leave maybe the audience or the readers, if they ever decide to pick it up, to deal with.
Yeah.
I think it's a playful game. This shows again more playfulness in place again. It's a playful book, sorry, I said. I keep calling it a game because that's mostly
No, it is playful, and it does get you thinking in a variety of different modes, which is quite impressive, actually. I wish it were slightly larger in its fonts. For us old people, that's it's a little bit difficult, but no, that was wonderful. And actually, I'm very much covered. I think that if we don't have any other questions, and
please realize that it's art for the public because they didn't.
I know.
We did, and we did, but maybe they have something about fictional games, or I don't even know. But if you say we're done, we're done. I'm very happy.
I think I would have expected to see questions right now. Maybe it would have helped if we sort of could have forced everyone to actually read the book before attending this. But seriously, thank you so much for being here. I love our conversations, and I think I cannot, suggest that people take a look at What We Owe the Dead and also fictional games strongly enough. I would also very much urge people to take a look at the games you've created and see how this different strain of game design does things in an unexpected but also very entertaining and very humorous manner, actually. I mean, how much can you play with the concept of the door? Apparently, a lot. So I do really suggest, especially game designers and people who are into actual games, take a look at your games also. And would you like to add something, Stefano?
I just wanted to say that it was an honor and a pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you. The questions were right on spot in what was important about the book without spoiling the actual
Yes,
plot.
I hope we haven't spoiled it because it's really. And again, I'll say the world building again, but it's you feel this sort of revelation whenever something opens up to you. So you have this book that drip feeds you information, and suddenly you realize that, oh, this is not just a simple game; it's something much more than that, and it has a whole history. And suddenly it sort of explodes with information for a while, and that gets you thinking quite a bit, and it feels very nice. It's actually very entertaining, and this is it makes you feel good, which is very important when it comes to art.
If there's one thing that maybe I can conclude with is that, sorry if I maybe sounded a bit dismissive of art and culture, but it's hard to be hopeful in this moment. But if some of you ever gets to read the book, sometimes to write these kind of things, and apart from occasions like now with Konstantinos, in which I have a post that somebody, maybe a few people out there are reading and thinking together with you. So if any of you actually end up reading What We Owe the Dead and want to drop me a line, that will make me feel I'm not just screaming in the abyss, but also the abyss has a say in the matter. So that would be nice. Like I'm happy to receive email, even questions about the text or anything. Like it's nice to feel that there's somebody on the other side of the cable. You hardly ever get to experience that unless when you go to places to present a book, but that's like I don't know, twice a year or something. So very rarely. I wanted to thank you again for your interest and for giving me a possibility to talk about
Thank
these things.
you, actually. Thank you for the books. Thank you for taking the time and this wonderful presentation and discussion. It's always very enlightening talking to you, to be honest. So again, and thanks everyone who stayed with us, and thank you all for being here. The video will remain on YouTube for people to take a look at. Feel free to visit Stefano's site. It's we've actually shared the links. Feel free to join our Discord. Have a look at the six, have a look at Stefano's books and games. And once again, thank you all for being here. And thanks a ton, Stefano. That was once again lovely. Final question, very quickly. Anything in the works when it comes to books?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
Anything else you're working on that you could perhaps share? Anything forthcoming or not yet?
We have a new philosophical game coming together with Daniele Giardini, Ahmed Khalifa, and a few other friends coming out beginning of next year. Again, short and free, and for you to think through things with video games.
And including all my favorite people. So that's fantastic. So thanks again, and good evening, good night, good morning, good whatever it is, wherever you are, everyone. Thank you.